Okay, so right now I'm going to go over the data and graphing notes. Basically, how do we create a graph? How do we create the tables? And what do we do with our data as we develop it? So, going through, remember we should have already previously seen that data is from our observations. It's the information that we collect when we make observations, especially when we're recording it, and there's both quantitative and qualitative data. And both of these types of data need to both be organized and then analyzed in order to make sense of them. So the vast majority of the time, what we end up doing is we organize the data into tables. And most of the time we make these tables before we even start collecting the data. When you do a scientific experiment, when you do research, you think about, well, what is it I'm going to observe? And you make tables so it's easy to record. It's easy to just check off what you see or don't see. So now in this table, the tables are the ones, they've got the blocks going across, blocks going down. You have to have the independent and dependent variables on there. They should be identified, and one should go across the top on the horizontal axis, and one should be going down the side, which is the vertical axis. Usually we put the independent on the vertical and the dependent going across the top. However, with tables you can do it the opposite way, just depending on how the data best fits. Okay, so that's our tables when we get our data organized. Now once we have our data organized into a table, then we can make a graph of it. So now with our graph, what you want to do is we basically can make two types of graphs. We can make bar graphs and line graphs. When you look at things like pictographs, realistically those are a type of bar graph. Pie graphs, those are a type of bar graph because it's simply showing large categories and percentage amounts. So anytime your data is in a category, we use a bar graph. So if it's not something that's got a range, if we're talking about months of the year, if we are talking about favorite colors, these are things that go in a bar graph. Things that have a range, anything that can be measured and you can put a scale along the side, and so you have the smallest amount over here and then it goes and it gets to be the biggest amount over here, we refer to that as we use that as a range, and we use a line graph for this. So how do you make your graph? Now much of this should be very, very familiar as you've gone through math and science for the last 8 or 9 years. However, I found there's a lot of things that people forget. So the very first step you do is you draw your X and Y axis. So you actually draw your line down and across. Then you want to label your X axis. Okay, that's down here with the title of our independent variable. And then label the Y axis with the title of the dependent variable. So our independent variable, that's the one as an investigator I'm changing. Okay, so this is the whether or not I put a plant in the sun or I put a plant in the shade. The y-axis, this is our data. What data did we collect? How tall did it get? This would be the height. That would be the y-axis here. Alright, so now once you've labeled it with the title, okay, of what it is that's going to be on that axis, then you need to put our actual scales on here. So if you're doing a bar graph, the x-axis is going to get labeled with the categories. For example, the shade or sun. On a line graph, it would be a scale. So for example, if I was looking at temperature and how well the plant grew, I would put 0 degrees and go all the way up to 80, 90 degrees so that I had a scale. Alright, then what you want to do is label the y-axis, and the y-axis is always with numbers. We always do a range on the y-axis for our dependent variable. Once you have your axes labeled with titles and labeled for our scales, then you go through and you plot your data points. Okay, so if you're doing a bar graph, you make bars and you color them or shade them in with different patterns. If you're doing a line graph, You plot the points, connect them with a line. If you're doing more than one line, use different shapes for each point. So whether it's dots or triangles or little squares or little asterisks. Finally, you want to make a key. Whatever colors or patterns you're doing for each data set, they need to have a key so that someone looking at the graph knows which ones are which. Okay, so if we look here, this is a kind of a good image here of what you need to have on a graph. You got to have your title, your y-axis label and the scale, your x-axis label and the scale. If I go down here a little bit more, here's one for a bar graph. Very similar. Okay, we've got our y-axis with our label, our x-axis with a label. We've got our title, we've got our data points, but on a bar graph you always have a key. On a line graph you don't always have a key, only if you have more than one line. Alright, the last point I want to make is there are a couple of things that people often do when they're doing graphs that they make mistakes on. The top mistakes that I end up seeing, which this should actually say top 9 mistakes on graphs are, number one, missing the title, having the big title at the top, not having it. You do want to have a title there. You don't want to make it super cutesy. Really having independent variable versus dependent variable, whatever those are, that's a great title. So basically, the whatever you have written down here, effect on whatever you have written over here, or versus whatever you have written over here. Gives you a great title, let someone look at the graph and know exactly what's going to be on it. Your source of data isn't given. So if you just have numbers on there, but you don't have what the numbers are, that makes life very, very difficult. If you have no key, whether it's a pictograph or bar graph, if there's no key there to figure out which ones are which, again, makes reading the graph really hard. Having the scales interrupted, you can't go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 25, 26, 27, 28. You gotta have the scale going all the way through. You just have to pick an interval that works for you. Having the scales not labeled, just having hash marks, again, doesn't really help somebody if they're really trying to figure out what the graph is saying. If you have symbols, if you're doing pictographs or bars, if things are skewed in what their scale is as far as their size or spacing, it makes things very, very hard to read. If you don't start your scales at 0, now there are extenuating circumstances where we start a little higher up, but for the vast majority of graphs, you want to have 0 be at the corner for both scales. That way you really have an idea of which way the numbers are going and how the data is being represented. If you don't have your numbers evenly spaced, so if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, we're not really accurately representing our data because the scale is uneven. And then also if the scale is selected to produce the desired results. So let's say I have a scale and it's from 0 to 100 and I want to show, let's say I'll say all of my students did really poorly on a quiz and the quiz is only out of 5 points. Well, if I show all of my students at the bottom, the best student ever who got 100% on the quiz really is going to look like they had nothing because their bar is only going to go up to 5. Same way as if I have that scale from 0 to 100, but this time what I am looking at is I am looking at the variations as we start looking, and you're looking at some other variations. You might end up wanting to have where it's showing too much. So if everything's at like 90, 100, 100, 100, 100, 100, 100, and the differences are tenths of a percent, well, then having whole number changes isn't going to actually show us the data, and we'll want to bring it, zoom the scale in so that we can see the tenths of a mark and see the variation in our data. Alright, hopefully this has answered everything. Your classwork today is working on the graphing packet. It is a Biozone one, and so that should be a little easier. There is some explanation text, the informative text. If you're finding yourself having a hard time, go back and read the text closely in those biozones, and they do actually help, as well as re-watching this video. Hopefully this helps you with your graphing skills, and I look forward to seeing you.